Here's the story with all website source references removed. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the money you earned just yesterday can no longer buy a single loaf of bread. Now imagine that happening every single day for 22 straight months. If you think that sounds impossible, wait until you hear what Milena and Branko lived through in Yugoslavia between 1992 and 1994. This is not fiction. Every number in the story is real. Every detail has been verified. And if this kind of content shocks and educates you, please hit subscribe, because we covered the financial collapses that history books leave out. Milena was a 38-year-old schoolteacher in Belgrade, Serbia, in early 1992. She had a stable job, a small apartment, and a husband named Branko, who worked at a state-run factory on the outskirts of the city. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, the kind of ordinary Yugoslav family that had survived decades of socialism with quiet dignity. Yugoslavia, before its collapse, had been the most open and prosperous of all communist-era states. Unlike their counterparts in Soviet bloc nations, ordinary Yugoslavs had access to a wide range of consumer goods, from clothes and appliances to travel agencies and discotheques. Milena and Branko had savings tucked away, around 15,000 Deutschmarks hidden at home. A common habit among Yugoslav families of that era. By the early 1990s, a typical Yugoslav family had saved anywhere between 10,000 and 40,000 Deutschmarks in hard currency, kept outside official banking channels, literally hidden in mattresses. That hidden cash would soon become the government's greatest weapon against its own people. By March 1992, everything Milena and Branko had known about money, stability, and the future began to dissolve. Between 1992 and 1994, Serbia and Montenegro experienced the second longest period of hyperinflation in world economic history after 1920s. Russia, caused by explosive growth in the money supply during the Yugoslav Wars. The trigger was devastating and deliberate. In 1992, the United Nations imposed sanctions on what remained of Yugoslavia as a result of the carnage occurring in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Milosevic saw only one solution: print money. Branko's factory wages were paid every 2 weeks. But by mid-1992, what he earned in the first week was worth far less by payday than it had been on the day he worked for it. Prices increased 17,200% in 1992, and an incredible 3 quadrillion% in 1993. Read that number again, 3 quadrillion% in a single year. Milena began doing something that seemed insane to outsiders. She would rush to the market the moment Branko received his salary and spend every single dinar immediately. Waiting even a few hours meant losing purchasing power. Store prices were given in points, with each point equal to the Deutschmark, and the conversion was made either in Deutschmarks or in diners at a black market exchange rate that often changed several times per day. Would stand in line at a bakery in the morning, and by the time he reached the counter, the price had already been marked up again. This was not a rumor. It was the daily reality of 10.5 million people living inside the collapsing Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Inflation was logged at 62% per day, at an hourly rate of 2.03%, and prices in shops were hiked several times a day. To understand what 2.03% per hour means for a working family, Milena's morning grocery budget was worth $20 at 8 a.m. It was worth roughly $15 by noon. By the time she went back for the evening meal, it was worth almost nothing in dinar terms. Average monthly wages bottomed out at an incredible level of only USD $10 per month. That was what Branko's factory wage was worth in real terms by the peak of the crisis. Milena's teacher salary fared no better. The government kept issuing nominal pay raises that meant absolutely nothing against the tidal wave of inflation. Real monthly wages in the formal sector dropped to just 15% of the 1991 wage level. Branko's factory began distributing a so-called packet, a package of goods, instead of, or, alongside, the increasingly worthless dinar salary. The packet could consist of large quantities of food and household items, such as laundry detergent, soap, and toothpaste, but its value varied enormously depending on the employer. Some workers received generous packages. Others received a single bar of soap. Pensioners, the unemployed, and refugees received nothing at all. Milena's elderly mother, a retired nurse living 2 streets away, had no access to any packet whatsoever. In October 1993, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Belgrade estimated that approximately 3 million people in Serbia and Montenegro were living at or below the poverty line. Poverty was at its highest in 1993, with 39% of the population living on less than $2 per month. Milena's mother survived on a small garden plot and whatever Milena could carry to her on weekends. The entire structure of civil life began breaking down around them. In November 1993, the government delayed turning on the heat in government-owned apartment buildings to save money and the buildings. Tenants bought inefficient space heaters which overloaded the electrical system, leading to blackouts. Branko and Milena spent that winter in a cold apartment, burning whatever wood they could find, wearing coats indoors, and cooking on a small gas ring whenever fuel was available. Gas stations had become a memory. Yugoslavia's gas stations were closed, and gasoline could only be bought from black market entrepreneurs on the sides of roads. The black market became the real economy. Food, medicine, fuel, cigarettes, virtually everything was traded in Deutschmarks, not diners. The collapse of the dinar legitimized the Deutschmark status as the de facto currency of Yugoslavia, and the federal government's decision on January 6, 1994, formally recognized the Deutschmark as the official currency. If you had Deutschmarks saved, like Milena and Branko did, you could survive. If you had only diners, you were ruined, and the government knew exactly how to exploit that divide. The National Bank of Yugoslavia printed large quantities of paper currency distributed to state enterprises, ministries, and banks to cover their expenses, and these institutions then purchased hard currency from the public with the newly printed dinars. In essence, the government was engineering a machine to vacuum the savings of ordinary citizens. Milena and Branko watched their 15,000 Deutschmark reserve shrink, not from spending, but from a desperate series of currency exchanges forced upon them by the government's manipulations. In 1 year, between December 1992 and December 1993, the effective exchange rate between the Yugoslav dinar and the US dollar went from 900 dinars per dollar to 3 million dinars per dollar. Let that number sink in for a moment. That is 3 followed by 18 zeros. Printing presses ran day and night. The National Bank of Yugoslavia issued 33 banknotes during the hyperinflation period, of which 24 were issued in 1993 alone. At the end of 1993, a 500 billion dinar banknote was printed minus 500 billion dinars, for which, ultimately, not a single German mark could be purchased on the street market. That banknote was worth less than the paper it was printed on. Meanwhile, Branko watched his factory slow to a crawl. For 1993 alone, there was a 30% decline in GDP, a decrease in investments in industrial production of 37%, and unemployment reached 24.1%. The factory where Branko worked went on forced vacation, a Yugoslav euphemism for indefinite layoff without proper dismissal. Milicevic issued dinars to placate hundreds of thousands of workers laid off or put on forced vacations by idled factories. Workers like Branko were given meaningless dinar payments just to keep them quiet and stationary. Milena continued teaching, but her school ran out of basic supplies by autumn of 1993. There was no chalk, no paper, no heating. The health system around them collapsed with a terrifying speed. By late 1993, hospitals lacked basic antibiotics and functioning equipment such as X-ray devices. In November 1994, 87 patients died in Belgrade's Institute of Mental Health, which had no heat, food, or medicine. Survival for Milena's family, like for millions of others, became entirely dependent on connections, ingenuity, whatever hard currency remained hidden at home. Survival depended increasingly on political or family connections, charitable help from humanitarian organizations, or black marketeering. Branko began trading on the side, helping move goods through informal channels, accepting Deutschmarks for small services. It was technically illegal, but so was starving, drug use, domestic violence, and the proportion of young people reporting psychological or emotional trauma rose sharply during this period. Milena noticed the change in their neighborhood, the quiet desperation, the arguments heard through thin walls at night, the children who came to school pale and unfed. An estimated 800,000 people immigrated from Serbia in the 1990s, 20% of whom had higher education. Their neighbor's son, 24-year-old engineer, left for Germany in September 1993 with nothing but a suitcase and a promise to send money back when he could. He was one of hundreds of thousands of educated young people who simply walked away. The chaos threatened total paralysis of the national monetary system and state services, including the crumbling transport, health, and social welfare sectors. Belgrade economists described it in haunting terms at the time, like trying to predict a cosmic catastrophe, something that had never been experienced before in modern economic history. And yet, the government pressed on. Economists agreed that the main cause of Yugoslavia's hyperinflation was not sanctions, but the unrestrained printing of the dinar to underwrite the Greater Serbia program. Milosevic's financial support for Bosnian and Croatian Serbs was estimated at up to 40% of gross national product, which had plummeted to less than $10 billion from $30 billion in 1989. Ordinary people like Milena and Branko were financing a war they never voted for through the invisible tax of hyperinflation. Every dinar bill in their wallet was a small transfer of wealth from their household to the machinery of conflict. The government also tried price controls twice. There were two misguided attempts to control inflation using administrative price controls, the first in June 1992, and the second in August 1993. These price controls were not only unsuccessful in reducing inflation, but predictably resulted in mass shortages and further collapse of economic activity. Bakers refused to bake bread at controlled prices that didn't cover their flour costs. Milena spent an entire morning in December 1993 walking to 5 different shops in Belgrade looking for basic cooking oil. 4 were closed. The 5th had none left. By January 1994, the monthly inflation rate hit its devastating peak. Inflation peaked at a monthly rate of 313 million % in January 1994, with the annual rate reaching 116,545,906,563,330%. That is 116 trillion % per year. There is no historical comparison in the modern era that comes close to what Milena, Branko, and their neighbors were experiencing in those final, terrible weeks. Real GDP in 1993 was not higher than about 50% of the 1991 level, a massive, cumulative loss of economic output, wiping out a decade of progress in just 2 years. Then, on January 24, 1994, the government launched the Avramovic program, a radical monetary stabilization plan led by economist Dr. Yugoslav Avramovic. The program tackled the causes, transmission mechanisms, and monetary consequences of extreme Yugoslav hyperinflation, with the currency board and a bold currency reform at its core. A new currency, the super dinar, was pegged directly to the Deutschmark at a 1:1 ratio. The printing presses stopped. The hyperinflation finally ended in March 1994, and by 1995, the annual inflation rate had returned to a more manageable, if still painful, minus 122%. For Milena and Branko, the silence after the storm was strange and disorienting. They had survived. but they had lost savings, years, health, and diversion of their country that would never return. Slobodan Milosevic remained in power for another 6 years before finally resigning following disputed elections in September 2000. The people who engineered the collapse faced no immediate consequences. The people who suffered it, millions of ordinary families, carried the wounds for decades. What happened in Yugoslavia between 1992 and 1994 stands as one of the most severe economic catastrophes ever inflicted on a civilian population in peacetime conditions. It was not an accident. It was a policy choice to fund war by destroying the savings and livelihoods of ordinary people. Milena and Branko's story is a story that deserves to be told, remembered, and studied, so that the patterns of monetary destruction can never again be called unrecognizable. Now, we want to hear from you. Do you think ordinary citizens in Yugoslavia could have done anything differently to protect themselves? Or were they completely at the mercy of a system designed to exploit them? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters, and we read every single one. And if this story shocked you, educated you, or made you think differently about money, power, and collapse, please subscribe. New stories like this one drop every week, and the next one might just change how you see the financial world around you entirely.